Hey, everybody, it's Tommy Canelli, and welcome back to Before the Lights podcast, the show that tells you how they made their mark. He has made a career protecting people and organizations by teaching them to protect themselves. He was an officer in the US Marines and an author of his new book, Live Ready, a guide to protecting yourself in an uncertain world. He was a protection specialist for the heads of state, dignitaries, celebrities, and CEOs, and the inventor of the response pen. He's the founder of Live Ready, an organization which provides comprehensive enterprise, risk management, personal protection, and training. Let's welcome in Sam Rosenberg. Sam, welcome to the show.
Hey, Tommy, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
You are welcome, and thank you for your service.
You're welcome.
Tell me then, let's start here. What did the Marines teach you about psychological training?
The number one thing that I really loved about my time in the Marines, and especially going through officers training, is what does it take to take a kid who is like, say, an 18-year-old, 20-year-old kid who's never been in a fight in their life possibly, and teach them how to survive combat, both psychologically and physically. And physiologically, and that was an interesting science to be able to see and to experience. Besides that, just in general, the lessons learned were unbelievable, and I talked about things in my book, this book, Live Ready, that I talk about is things like, just having the right kind of mindset to be able to push through hardships and difficulties and challenges.
Listeners, I'm going to put a link in the show notes to Sam's website and the book. I've read it. It is excellent. You need to get it not just for yourself, but your family and your loved one as well. We're going to get into some of the things in the book. But Sam, when I say the name Kevin Pegnato, who is that to you?
Kevin's an old friend of mine. He was one of my first real mentors. When I got out of the Marine Corps and I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, I didn't really have any direction, if you will. I had these hopes and dreams of leading troops in battle and it's sort of like this kind of thing. And I realized that I was allergic to bureaucracy. So, I went to the Marines with the right attitude. I'm very proud of being a Marine officer, but I can tell you that I did not really want to make a career out of it. So got out and I didn't know what I was going to do. I was going to go, law school or something, which I'm so glad I didn't on a lot of different levels. I was possibly going to go into law enforcement, and a friend of mine introduced me to this guy named Kevin Pegnato. And Kevin was a truly light years ahead of his day personal security trainer. So he was a self-defense guy here in Pittsburgh, where I'm from. He had a small practice. He was doing some close protection work in addition to doing self-defense and executive self-defense. And he was really my first real mentor in terms of understanding what does it take to protect people and organizations, and what does it take to be able to protect yourself.
You've been in martial arts since you were a child. You had your fair share of fights in high school and on the streets. You've worked as a bouncer. You attended the University of Pittsburgh, where you were a wrestler. And then in 2003, you went from protecting others to teaching to protect themselves. Sam, what was that moment for you that you went, you know what, I'm going to start teaching people instead of protecting them?
It was not too long after we had this amazing gig. It was a short-term gig, but it was protecting Benjamin Netanyahu when he was during a speaking tour. And this is with Kevin, and it was one of those deals where, I just had a philosophical shift, that to me, it's good to have a lifeguard, but ultimately you should know how to swim. And I had already been teaching self-defense, and I'd already been doing both of these things. When we weren't doing high stakes, close protection, I was teaching self-defense. I was working with private clients, learning firearms, things like that. And, the idea was that I just decided that I wanted to teach the same skills that we use to protect public figures to everybody. And it's now been a 20-year journey. And that 20-year journey has culminated literally in this book. And the concept of Live Ready is to distill the most important lessons learned over that 25-year period. And really this mentality of being responsible for your own personal security. That personal security is a fundamental human need, but it is an individual responsibility. The lifeguards of society simply won't be there when we need them. And the concept of this book is to provide that operating system, if you will. So everybody, whether you're talking about you, your family, kids going to college, workplace, everybody understands exactly how to.
The days of helping one another seem to have been gone by the wayside. And now it's become a sit and watch and get our phones out. Why is that shift?
I think it's an interesting perspective. It's something that, as you know, from reading the book, obviously we talk about it in depth, but there's an idea called spectator syndrome. Okay. So going all the way back to the 70s, early 70s, the Kitty Genovese, case and some others where, a woman was brutally raped and murdered in Central Park area. And there was something like 150 people, heard the assault and heard her cries for help, and nobody called the police. Well, the idea back then was they coined this term spectator syndrome, of the idea that people just assume other people have already handled it. Someone else has already called the police. And there's this sort of, it's not my responsibility mentality. Well, this thing has evolved. This dynamic has evolved now to a point where instead of people just assuming it's not their problem or that someone else is there to help and they'll take care of it, nowadays, like you said, people will literally whip out their phones and film. I kind of half jokingly say in an active shooter situation, if you respond to it and you fight back, some will help, others will flee, and others will film. And, it's kind of a little comical interlude, but the reality is that is a depiction of our society. Only a few will help, most will run, the vast majority, they just want to watch. And I think it's just a part, it's a symptom, if you will, Tommy, of the whole dynamic that we have in our society nowadays, of this voyeuristic sort of desensitized, society. Everyone is systematically desensitized to violence to such an extreme that it's entertainment. And it manifests in this bizarre kind of way of doing things. If you'll allow me, the worst case scenario I've ever seen of this, the worst dynamic I've ever seen is what we were seeing after 10/7 with Hamas. And, what you're seeing there is intentionally using social media and, video footage and cell phone cameras, in some cases using the victim's own social media accounts to record horrific acts against those victims so that their family will be the first one receiving the messages. Most horrific barbarism we've ever seen in the modern age since Nazi Germany. And, it's the same dynamic. And what do we see out of a lot of the population? Other people thinking, like, either shaking their head and going, it's not a problem, or even celebrating it themselves. It's terrible.
There was many eye-opening moments by reading this book. And listeners, I can't recommend getting this book enough. The number of school shootings has risen drastically. But here was the eye-opener for me, Sam. We don't hear about the ones that were stopped. And I thought that was a moment for me going, whoa, you know what? He's absolutely correct. We don't. I'm sure there's not an exact number, but can you speak about maybe the times that things were stopped that are not put out in the media?
It'd be almost impossible to estimate how many mass shootings or potential mass killers have been stopped before they executed their attack. Almost impossible to estimate that, but I would tell you it's a high number. And law enforcement is getting exceptionally good at recognizing the warning signs early enough to intervene. A lot of citizens are becoming better equipped, and the tools that are in this book teach you what to look for. But a lot of citizens are becoming better equipped to recognize the warning signs, the, understanding when something is no longer just sort of a weird thing someone says, but potential indicator of someone moving in the wrong direction. And the dynamic, though, is that, in many cases, what I would tell you is that the killers themselves, Tommy, and this is one of the dynamics I try to explain in the chapters that deal with killer culture, okay, is the killers themselves, I fundamentally believe most of them don't actually want to commit a horrific attack. I think most of them actually want some attention. They want someone to intervene. They want people to take them seriously. And what they do is they leak their intent by way of these warning signs and indicators and threats and things like that, that functionally, if they're not ignored and someone actually intervenes, that's what they want. They want to be sort of given that credibility. The problem is when people ignore those warning signs, people kind of take this mentality of, if you don't think I'm serious, I'm going to show you I'm serious, right? And in many ways, it parallels suicide, okay, in a strange way. People who are contemplating or moving in the direction of suicide very often will leave sort of like cries for help, right? These warning signs that are these cries for help. And what they want is intervention. I think that a lot of times mass killers are the same. And there really are two distinct categories there. There's mass killers who are moving in that direction by virtue of situational factors. And then there's mass killers, such as the Hamas killers, for example, who they want to do this, right? You know, these are on a mission, they're motivated, they're mission oriented in this direction in such a way that they're not going to be deviated. They might choose to go after this target instead of that target for a variety of tactical reasons, but ultimately they're not dropping leakage signs as cries for help. You know, if you pick up on the warning indicators, they need to be stopped instead of intervened with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does completely. Not only, I mean, we hear about it here because we live in the United States, but do other countries face this same problem with school shootings?
Yeah, continuously. And I would say that not quite on the same scale as us, but mass killings are a worldwide problem. And it's a problem that can be seen not only worldwide from the standpoint of it actually happening, but we also can see the effects in terms of other dynamics, such as a lot of people in the mass killing dynamic, right? When we look at this and we look at active shooters, okay, a lot of people will say to themselves, well, if we just get rid of the guns, we won't have this problem, or the loss of life will be so drastically reduced that it won't be an issue. And a lot of people look at it on the other side and they say it's a mental health problem. And the reality of it is it's kind of like a little bit of both, but the dynamic here is that on the mental health side, what we understand is that most people who are mentally ill are not dangerous. And if on the side of the guns, if we snap our fingers and guns disappear from society, we will still have this manifestation of violence. As a perfect example is China, right? Where in China, citizens don't have guns, right? There is no gun. There's total gun control. And what you see is unbelievably horrific mass stabbings on commuter trains and subways and in nursery schools or in some cases daycares. You still see the level of violence that we are seeing in every society and culture. What you see is a change from one weapon system to another. Okay. So at the root of this, we have to address this on a global societal level. And that's what we talk about in the book in terms of this cocktail between narcissism and paranoia and sort of this deeply narcissistic society we've created.
From the book, listeners, since 1982, TV violence has increased 780%. And in the same period, teachers have reported a nearly 800% increase of aggressive acts on the playground. My question, Sam, then is violence random?
Violence is not random.
Okay.
And it is, a lot of people use that word and we hear it a lot in the media, an act of random violence or someone just snapped or no one saw it coming. We hear these things all the time. And this is what I call the myth of randomness, because why we like to cling to this myth and why it's such a, term that is bounced around is because if we suggest that violence is random, it is therefore unpredictable. And if it is unpredictable, what responsibility do we have towards managing it, preventing it, responding to it, what have you? The dynamic, though, is that violence is a process as predictable and observable as boiling water if you know what to look for and are in a position to see the signs. So if you're at the mall and a mass killer has chosen to target that mall, you may not be certainly in a position to have seen the early warning indicators and leakage that killer intended to launch an attack on some place in society. But you can certainly pick up on the first indicators that the attack has begun and respond to it effectively. But in our own lives, if we're walking down the street and we're dealing with common everyday situations that we all may face, but we want to understand that violence is a process. And that process is a 4-stage process. Okay. I call it in the book, I call it TIME. This is a methodology that I've used for 2 decades now. Target selection, interviewing or intelligence gathering, method of attack, and then escape exploitation. So to give you a very simple analogy, imagine the 9/11 terrorists, okay, right? So one of them says, hey guys, before they attack, let's blow up the World Trade Center. So we have target selection. Another one says, I got an idea. Let's fly an airplane into the building. So we have a proposed method of attack. Well, the reason why they don't just jump on the next plane and try it is because they haven't thoroughly vetted their plan. And there's a potentially high degree of failure in that plan, right? So what they do is they enter into what I call the eye of time. And in the eye of time is where all of the sort of pre-operational planning is taking place. This is the intelligence phase, where they're testing and probing the target. They do surveillance. They gather manpower and weapons. They refine their plan. And ultimately, when they've made their decisions that this plan has merit and they launch the attack, the M of time turns into this sort of moment of commitment, this moment of the attack when the attackers make their intentions known. The hijackers take over the planes. You know, in a conventional scenario, a lot of times if the bad guy has an escape plan, the E of time is the escape. Otherwise, if it's a suicide mission, we call it the exploitation facet. And exploitation is Al-Qaeda taking credit and saying, hey, we did this, be afraid we could do it again. So the reality of this, Tommy, is this model is clearly evident when we're looking at something as big as a terrorist attack. We could break down Hamas, attack 110-7 the exact same way. The questions, though, are, well, do street criminals do the same thing? Are people looking to do rape, robbery, murder, assault? Do they do the exact same thing?
Sure.
And the answer is absolutely. It just happens in a compressed time frame. You could be walking down the street at a concert, and there's someone looking at people going, no, yeah, that one looks good. There's target selection. Well, you absolutely know they have a method of attack in mind. They want to do something, rape, robbery, murder, whatever it is. But they got to be careful in how they choose their target, because what if they chose the wrong target and that target could actually fight back or will fight back, make it hard on them? There's failure there. There's potential for injury. There's potential for getting killed, getting hurt, getting caught. So what happens is they still do the eye of time. It just takes the form of an interview where someone comes up and talks to you. Can I talk to you for a sec? Do you have the change? Right? Or they engage you in a longer term process if it's a social dynamic, say in college, or you're at a party, or you're dealing with a coworker. Those social interactions may present themselves as a longer term interview, particularly if the person's more persuasion oriented, someone who uses charm. So the idea here is being able to recognize when you're in the eye of time is critical, because we can't always control being targeted. We can do everything right in the world. We can always try to avoid trouble and treat people with dignity, but it's ultimately the bad guy's choice whether they choose to target you. Sometimes you do everything right and they still say, if I can't have you, no one can. So you have to understand when you are in that eye of time so that you can avoid it, or basically deter it from escalating into an attack moment that you have to defend yourself. If we understand those phases and we understand how to recognize simple things, paying attention is the prerequisite. But if you're paying attention to your environment, you recognize, hey, I don't like the way this guy's looking at me. What's going on here? And be able to rapidly analyze that. Or if you understand that when an approach actually manifests itself as an interview, that's when you can interrupt the entire attack cycle in its tracks. Ultimately, why violence isn't random is because it doesn't just come out of the blue. No one sees it coming. There's always these warning signs. And if you know what those warning signs mean and how to interrelate to them and respond to them, functionally speaking, you can address things in such a way that you can deter or diffuse it before it escalates. So
you spoke about time, which was excellently described in the book. And there's another acronym called SAFE, which is stimulus, analysis, formulation, and execution. And listeners, he talks about this acronym and how it all can happen in about a half a second. And I'm going to tell you how you're going to learn about this. And that's, you're going to buy the book, because I'm not going to have Sam explain it. You're going to actually buy the book to learn about SAFE. He gave you time. I'm not going to give you SAFE as well. But where I am going to go, Sam, is here. police have this model of serve and protect. And there's a lot of people that believe that the police are everywhere and they're going to protect us. But the police can't be everywhere and they can't protect us when a bad guy decides they're going to strike.
Yeah. So, I think one of the greatest sort of misunderstood dynamics about law enforcement is, and let me caveat this, I know a lot of law enforcement officers. I think most of them that I know are exceptional people who would do anything they could to be there in the moment of truth to protect the average citizen, right? Like that's why they got into the job. They want to be there. But most people think that the police have a duty to protect them. And the police actually do not have a duty to protect you. Your personal security is your responsibility. The law enforcement community's duty principally is to enforce the law. So when someone breaks the law, if they can make an arrest or if they can intervene, they will. And most cops will protect you if they can. But the reality is they can't be there all the time. All right. We know that they're not going to be around the corner at the moment of truth. And all you have to do is look at, for example, since we talked about it earlier, the extreme, we look at the active shooter dynamics. The average law enforcement response to an active shooter event is 15 minutes. Okay. The average duration of an active shooter event is less than that. Right. 12 minutes on average. So, the problem is a mathematical problem. Right. That the scenarios are the vast majority of active shooter events are going to be over well before law enforcement arrival, for the most part. Now, there are certainly some decisive examples of cops shooting it out with the bad guys and taking them down. But the reality is that we have to be responsible for our own personal safety. We have to learn how to live ready.
When something happens, and we're involved in a situation where it's a bad guy, an active shooter, an active crime, whatever it is, assault, adrenaline will kick in. How much does adrenaline play a factor then in protecting yourself and being able to recall the things that you may have learned or trained to?
That's a great question, Tommy. So, this is something that has been studied fairly extensively. In fact, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman was kind enough to write the foreword to my book, is one of the world's leading researchers and experts on how human beings perform under stress. I've actually gone and become certified by a group called the Force Science Institute, which is also one of the leading organizations studying human performance under stress. And the issue is this: adrenaline will work for us to a point, and then it becomes a problem in many ways. So if you think about it as three zones of sort of like an RPM meter is how I describe it.
Okay.
Sitting here 60 to 80 beats per minute of normal resting heart rate, we've got no issues. We're in homeostasis, everything's fine. Well, if something happens that causes a little jolt of fear, excitement, whatever, and we start getting an adrenaline reaction, the very first phase is that sort of performance zone that everybody is familiar with who's played sports, driven a race car or driven a car fast. You kind of get that exhilaration of, roller coaster. That level of adrenaline is where you're functionally optimized, where you're stronger, faster, more effective, more decisive, more, capable. Okay. The problem that we have is when we encounter a stimuli that we don't have a lot of experience with, and particularly if it's a scary stimuli, and our brain hits that analysis phase that you mentioned as part of SAFE. Okay. If we don't have a lot of information there, if we have only traumatic information or the wrong information, we get hung up on that. And basically the brain will start to freeze. And we literally go into kind of a paralysis response. The most common reaction to extreme stress is, in fact, freezing. It's not fleeing. It's not fighting. That fight-flight process was never meant to denote behavior. It was meant to denote an internal response to stress. So the idea here is that freeze reaction is almost ubiquitous in terms of human responses to danger, as we all freeze to a degree, some much longer than others. If you have training and capabilities, you can come out of it very, very quickly, but there's always a degree of hesitation. The concept, though, is that once we slip into that category, if we don't know what to do, then that adrenaline reaction goes through the roof and it manifests itself in a massive cascade of performance effects. Tunnel vision, where we lose our peripherals, everything getting quiet, inability to access higher thinking capacities and cognitive thought processes, inability to use fine and complex motor control, loss of bowel and bladder control, all that stuff. So the idea here is that we don't want to lose control of that. Now, there's only one way to actually condition ourselves to ensure that we don't lose control at that level and that we retain the ability to think and make decisions, even under the effects of adrenaline and extreme stress. And that is training. All right. Now, training starts literally with the information here. Mm-hmm. This is the basis. My recommendation in this book is that this book tells you everything that nobody knows to teach you. It tells you everything that you need to know to properly condition yourself to have a legitimate opportunity and a legitimate chance of fighting back, right? And not only surviving, but thriving, but you still need physical training. Mm-hmm. And part of the book is going to navigate you through how to select the right training and what is the right training.
Yeah, and I'm not telling you that either, listeners. You're going to have to buy the book. I'm going to have him talk about some other things, but not that. Sam, can learned helplessness be unlearned?
Oh, most definitely. I do it every day.
See, and I think there's people that feel like I'm helpless. I can't do anything for myself.
Yeah. I mean, listen, if I never underestimate how much I can change myself, and I try never to overestimate how much I can change others. Okay. All I can do is influence them, Tommy. What I can do is lead them down that path. So if someone is absolutely committed, and I have met these people, if someone is absolutely thoroughly committed that they are helpless, no matter what the situation, there's nothing I can do for them by training. But if someone's got an open mind and they don't want to be helpless, I can absolutely show them the path. And, the thing is, we all have been conditioned, whether we want to admit it or not. We've been conditioned by society and well-meaning people, law enforcement, you name it. This notion that we are unable to respond to protect ourselves in certain circumstances. But the reality is you're never helpless as long as you can control one factor, if that factor is your mind, your ability to think and make decisions, which is, again, why the information in this book is so important, because it is the software. It's how do you condition your mindset? How do you condition yourself to be able to process? And there's an indelible link to the physical, but the concept here is that it has to start somewhere, and just understanding it, as we are, our greatest asset is our cognitive capacity as a human. Understanding the why, understanding what those conditioning factors are and how to overcome them, and is the first step to overcoming it. And, then it's just a matter of doing the work. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Can then listeners and people that are reading your book, I don't even know if this is possible, but is it? Can you avoid a bad situation? I know you can get yourself out of one that may be transpiring, but can you really avoid a bad situation?
No question about it. In fact, most situations are avoidable.
Oh,
so the critical dynamic is this. All right. The first rule of self-defense is to be able to, what I call, deny opportunity. And, most people think when they hear that is they say things like, well, yeah, of course, I don't go downtown, or I don't drink, or I don't go out at night, as if bad things only happen to certain people in certain places and certain times, right? The reality of denying opportunity is not only to be able to recognize danger, it's being able to recognize when you may be being targeted, all right? And when I use phrases like that, it scares people sometimes, but the reality is, targeting is not always just some guy going to jump out of the bushes with a ski mask. Very often, it's someone who appears charming and persuasive and, seems to have all of those qualities that are appealing. And the reality is that you've got to be able to recognize if you are dealing with someone who is using charm or persuasion as a tool, okay? And are these people, do they have your best interests in mind? So recognizing danger, recognizing when you are being targeted is not a hard task, but it requires specialized training. And that training and that knowledge is simply not in the world right now en masse. It is in this book, okay, at a very high level, at a level that a college kid can understand, a high school kid can understand, or an intelligence, a member of the intelligence community would benefit from. So the mentality targeted, even when it's very subtle, right, is critical. And then you can go into deterrence. Deterrence is creating in the mind of the adversary fear, right? And again, this is where we start to run headlong into some of our social conditioning. And we all go to great lengths, myself included, I'm sure you do as well, of trying to avoid making other people feel uncomfortable. We want them to feel comfortable. We want them to feel included and welcome. Right. And the thing about it, though, is that sometimes you have to know when to turn that switch and stand up for yourselves and establish boundaries that you will not let anyone cross. And that's a very, very important life skill. And I don't know a single dad who doesn't want to teach their daughters that. I don't know anyone who doesn't want to teach their kids that in general. It's just, how do you do it, right? Well, there has to be some very tangible dynamics to this. And knowing when you're in danger is the process of saying, okay, at this point now, definitively, I will go into a deterrence mode and diffuse this. And that's how you can avoid those situations from escalating in the first place, is recognizing those early warning signs and then taking the right actions, making the right moves at that point.
Our radars are dependent on our senses. I would like to talk about the example of how fast and accurate our radars really are by the story of the US Airways ticketing agent, Mike Tuohey. I thought that you couldn't have found a better example to put in the book. I highlighted it. I thought, man, my listeners have to hear this story from you because it really encapsulates how accurate our radars are.
Mike Tuohey was a ticketing agent on 9/11, and was it American Airlines, US Airways? I can't remember.
US Airways.
I'm confused. US Airways, yeah. So, and the idea was that, he was about to go on a break and he decides to see these two well-dressed gentlemen and check them in. And those two gentlemen were Abdulaziz Al-Amari and Muhammad Atta, all right, two of the 9/11 terrorists, okay? And the idea was that what was powerful about Tuohey's story in such a way is that he goes into this process of checking them in and checking their bags and whatever else in their tickets. And then you have to look at them and look at their license. And he said he looked at this guy and the hair stood up on the back of his neck, and this thought registered in his head that had never happened before, where he said, if this guy doesn't look like a terrorist, nobody does. And he said immediately his brain checked that thought and said, no, wait a second, that's not right. You're not supposed to think that. That's inappropriate. And he overrode it very, very quickly. And he went back into the process and he checked these guys in, but it left this very lasting feeling of something wasn't right here. Well, these guys go on onto their flight. They change planes. They ultimately fly their plane into the World Trade Center. And Mike Tuohey didn't realize, his first thought when he heard about that plane hitting the building was, he says, oh, my God, I feel bad for these guys. I put two guys in first class on this plane, and here I am thinking they're terrorists. And now the poor guys are dead. Right. And then he heard about the second plane hitting, and his brain instantly realized, unequivocally realized, I was right. Those guys were terrorists and they caused that plane to crash. Well, Mike Tuohey has gone on to, for 20 years now, and I've seen him interviewed several times, and he's talked about the post-traumatic stress that he has suffered. I mean, this poor guy, had he done anything, people think if he had done anything differently, like they wonder, could something have been changed? Nothing would have happened differently. Had he run to the nearest law enforcement or then pre-TSA private security, nothing would have happened differently. This guy did not do anything wrong, but he truly feels responsible in some ways and has been suffering ever since. There was actually another ticketing agent who committed suicide, right? Similar experience after the event. So I try to be very clear to tell people, I don't think that Tuohey did anything wrong. But what was very powerful about his story is the way he describes how he picked up on these guys' intent, if you will. The very first thing that happened was he had a physiological reaction. And this is what you were getting at, Tommy, of how the brain operates, how the radar works. His physiological reaction was the hair stood up on the back of his neck. And I always tell people, if you're walking down the street and you see someone and the hair stands up, you get a sinking feeling, a chill runs up your spine. That's your first warning sign that you're about to be interviewed, right? That you're basically in danger. There's a degree of danger present. The second warning sign is that alarm. And that alarm is that alarming thought that he had of this guy doesn't look like a terrorist, nobody does. Now, the thing about it is to understand that those alarms are coming from the limbic part of our brain, which we cannot control consciously. And that limbic brain has no sense of political correctness. It doesn't care about what you want, what your hopes and dreams are of the future, or what other people think about you. None of that makes any sense to it. All it cares about is survival. So when it sees something that it thinks is an anomaly, that radar will ping your conscious mind with an anomalous thought of like, this guy looks like a serial killer or a terrorist, a rapist or whatever, to try and jolt you into the present moment and pay attention. The problem that we have is now we have these two factors, the physiological reaction of fear coupled with the alarming thought. And we've got a pretty good warning mechanism now, which is very, very effective and very highly accurate. But what happens is we go into doing what Mike Tuohey did, and we fall into what I call the veils of denial, right? Where we go into the social veil and we say, oh, wait a minute, that's an inappropriate thought. I don't want to judge a book by its cover. I don't want to, profile someone. And so we simply override our radar. Or we go into sort of what I call the veil of normalcy, where we say, it's probably nothing. I don't see any real evidence why I should be worried here. So he said, it's probably nothing. Or we go into this reciprocity veil, like maybe if I'm nice to him, he'll be nice back, as if, everyone treats everyone with kindness. And some people don't see kindness as weakness. So the idea here is that my recommendation to people is to understand this story in such a way to be able to recognize when their radar is trying to warn them. All right, throughout all the noise that we encounter on a daily basis, and you get those legitimate warning indicators and listen to it, right? Don't override it. And you don't have to do anything necessarily. Sometimes the solution will be obvious. I want to cross the street. I want to avoid this person, whatever it is. Sometimes you don't have to do anything tactical in that moment. But the idea here is that you just don't want to override it, because when you override it, you make yourself far more vulnerable.
So we always say, trust your gut, trust your instincts. In this case, trust your radar. But it's got to be difficult then to act on what we're judging is wrong.
Especially in today's world, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like we're everyone, you got to be really, really careful. So this is a very, very important part of the book, and it's an important part of the discussion, is how do you actually articulate yourself? So, Tom, have you ever heard the term CYA?
Of course, cover your ass.
Yeah. So I use that term a little differently. Okay. And I call CYA, to me, means can you articulate? All right. So what I like to be able to do is express to people, and this is how I teach my investigators, my protection specialists, is if I were Mike Tuohey, or you were in a situation similar, and you feel morally compelled to bring attention to something you are concerned about, but you're really afraid that you don't want to be blamed a racist, an Islamophobe, or whatever the dynamic is. My recommendation is to articulate in an objective manner, right? So if you go to the law enforcement, say the local Mike Tuohey scenario, runs to the nearest cop and says, I think that guy over there is a terrorist. They're going to look at him like he's crazy. Right. They're going to immediately dismiss him mentally. All right. But if you go up there and say, listen, I cannot explain why, but when I looked at this guy, I had an overwhelming fear reaction. Right. The hair went up on the back of my neck. Right. I felt extraordinarily uncomfortable. I don't know why, but I believe it's something worth explaining to you in case you wanted to investigate it, right? That is speaking strictly to the objective facts of hand. And the facts at hand are, I had a reaction that was fear-based in the face of this guy, and I truly can't articulate it beyond that. That is something that an investigator, a law enforcement officer, an HR director, an executive, or anyone else would say, interesting, I want to know more. And they're gonna want to investigate that, because you're not lacing it, if you will, with a bunch of subjective judgments like, I think that person is a terrorist, or that person's going to commit a mass homicide event, or something like that. You know what I mean? What you're doing is you're speaking to the facts. Joe came into work this morning and said something very troubling to me. This is what he said, and it was more the tone of what he said than the actual words themselves. It gave me the creeps. A chill went up my spine. I just wanted to tell someone, right? Mm-hmm. Everyone can relate to those kinds of statements. It's just getting better at articulating them in a manner in which they will be listened to. Don't go to the judgment. Speak to the objective realities.
The book is called Live Ready, A Guide to Protecting Yourself in an Uncertain World. Go to the link in the show notes to get your hands on it. There's so much in there about training and things, listeners, that can help you protect yourselves. And as I was reading it, I thought, well, you know what? I'm going to give you a couple. We've talked about all this stuff that's happening and how our radars work and the things that are going on in this world. But I thought I would give you a couple of them just in case you need them before you get the book, because the book's got to get to you. So one of them is, Sam, is this one. Tell my listeners how important is the brainstem, that is the fuse box for our brains. And if it's attacked correctly, it could help you get away.
So there's only 4 ways to stop someone from attacking you. Okay. If they're in the mid process of that, a human being, how do you stop a human being or other living thing? Well, you can stop them psychologically. You know, I can literally put my dukes up, point a weapon at you, and the guy goes, okay, I don't want any more trouble, and he leaves. You don't control that. You can stop him by punching holes in them, you know, like an arrow or a spear or a gun, and they bleed out hemorrhagically, right? That takes a while, and it's pretty gruesome, and it's almost always deadly force oriented. You can stop them biomechanically by shutting down or breaking a leg or blowing out a knee, or you can stop someone neurologically. All right. Now, neurologically is not only the most effective way to do it, but it is the least effortful in many ways. You know, the brainstem is right here at the base of your neck, where your skull and your spinal cord meet. And that brainstem is your fuse box. It basically has the same net effect as the fuse box of our house. If a big power surge were to hit the fuse box, you know, the fuses blow so the house doesn't burn down. Okay. And the idea of the brainstem is to protect our entire nervous system. So if you're talking about a nervous system disruption and you see a boxer getting hit on the chin and knocked out or losing their balance, losing their equilibrium, what's happening is the jaw is slamming this little this mastoid process area behind the ear, causing a neurological reaction that blows out that fuse box partially, or to a degree. A full knockout could be a disruption that's a little more specific. If you hit the back of the neck directly, you get the best effect possible. So if you look at the UFC and all the fighting scenarios around the world, there's no fighting system that's competitive where you're allowed to hit someone in the back of the neck. Right? It's all off limits. And that's because of the net effect of how powerfully disruptive that is to the nervous system, the equilibrium, the balance, and you could just knock someone out flat out from that. Now, the problem is if you hit someone hard enough, they could seriously injure them. But if you were fighting for your life, I would highly recommend you remember that as a critical vulnerability in the body. It's not the groin, it's the back of the neck. I've had clients use that numerous times in different techniques and in different fashions to escape really bad situations, from kidnappings to true life and death situations, rapes and whatnot.
And if you're somebody out there going, yeah, well, I'm not a fighter, I'm not going to get into that, then let me help you here. How simple is this statement, Sam, of I'm sorry, I can't help you?
The I'm sorry I can't help you statement is just a pattern interrupt that we use to deal with interviews. Okay. So you're walking down the street, someone approaches you, boom, the radar goes off. You're like, man, I don't like this. This feels uncomfortable. That guy looks like a mugger, whatever it is. Well, don't dismiss that. If he continues to approach you and you put your hands out in a stop sign effect, right, and say, whoa, I can't help you. I'm sorry. I can't help you. Right. That's a very simple verbal pattern interrupt coupled with the nonverbal stop sign is very effective at causing people to check themselves, not see you as an easy target, and just pivot and go on to their next target. In many ways, it's like the joke about the bear, right? How fast do you have to outrun a bear, Tommy? Faster than the next guy.
Right.
And I know that's a horrible joke when we're talking personal security, but here's the reality of it. None of us, I am not, and neither are you, in the business of taking the bad guys out of society. All right. That's like the district attorney's job and law enforcement. The reality of it is our job is to make sure that they're not going to victimize you, your family. All right. You know, that bad guy is probably going to victimize someone. And that's very unfortunate. But the goal is to give you and empower you with the ability and your family with the ability to ensure that it is not them. They can see the warning signs, negotiate it, recognize the interviews, diffuse it if need be, or deter it. That I'm sorry, I can't help you is a very powerful one. And if that person continues forward, to know exactly when you need to go from talking to touching, right? And that transition point so that you don't hesitate and get surprised. So all of that is broken down into this operating system that is Live Ready.
Get the book. And if you read the book and you get training and you have self-protection, then I'm going to end the interview with this, Sam, is they have self-protection, they have training. Then in a sense, isn't this person becoming dangerous to the bad guy?
Most definitely. You know, I truly believe that the goal in many ways, in terms of being a truly responsible person, is to be dangerous yourself. You have to learn how to be dangerous. But we're not talking about being evil. We're not talking about someone who is going to use violence in an inappropriate way. It's to have the capacity to be able to use violence, to have the capacity to do some sort of injury if you need to on an opponent, but only to hold that in check specifically for defensive purposes. And I truly believe that this notion of being dangerous is something that we shouldn't shy away from, right? You know, each of us has that capacity. And in fact, I will go so far to say, Tommy, that I teach a lot of women, all right? And I do a lot of seminars around the country that I work with lots of women. Here's the deal. Who do you think, if you were to look at the animal world, what is the most dangerous creature on the planet? Is a mom protecting her cubs. You know, guys can be dangerous and they'll hurt you. Women will utterly destroy you. All right. You know, especially if they have the right motivation. So, you know, I really believe that everybody has the capacity to overcome this myth of helplessness and to sort of really understand that they can, in fact, be dangerous and that it's okay to embrace being dangerous yourself, because you're going to be dangerous within the framework of a character-driven, moral person. That's what it means to live ready.
Sam, thanks so much for coming on the show, talking about your book. Listeners, it's fantastic. I really enjoyed reading it, Sam. I really did.
Thank you so much, Tommy. I appreciate that.
You are welcome. Listeners, please check out my YouTube channel, The Light Tommy Canale. They're short, inspirational videos to get you started to have a greater life and a better you. The link is in the show notes. Until next time, I'm Tommy Canale. A salute, a chin chin.
Tommy, that was awesome. Thank you.